If you watched our first part about scientific experiments that crossed all ethical boundaries, you know that we've only discovered the tip of a much darker iceberg. Today, we'll dive even deeper into this abyss of scientific horror, revealing cases that are even more shocking and terrifying than anything we've seen before. Get ready to uncover experiments involving biological weapons, covert surgeries, and sterilization programs that affected hundreds of thousands of people. If you have the courage to face these disturbing truths, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. What's coming next will completely shake your beliefs about the limits of science.
Creating monsters. Vladimir Demikov. Now prepare yourself for something that seems straight out of a 1950s science fiction movie, but actually happened in real life in the Soviet Union. Vladimir Demikov was a surgeon who became obsessed with the idea of organ transplants, but his ambitions went far beyond what any sane person would consider ethical or necessary. Between 1954 and 1959, Demikov conducted a series of experiments that involved literally creating two-headed dogs. He would take small puppies and transplant them onto the necks of larger dogs, creating bizarre creatures that defied all natural laws. These hybrid animals could drink water, bite, and even fight each other. The two heads on the same body frequently attacked one another. The process was brutal. Demikov would cut off the head and front limbs of a puppy and sew them onto the neck of an adult dog, connecting the circulatory systems so that the recipient dog's blood would keep the transplanted head alive. Most of these experiments resulted in death after a few days or weeks, but some survived. For more than a month, living in a constant state of agony and confusion. Demikov justified these horrors by saying he was paving the way for future human transplants, but the reality is that he was satisfying a morbid curiosity about the limits of life and death. He meticulously documented each experiment, took photos, made films, and even exhibited his creations to other scientists as if they were scientific trophies. The most disturbing part of all, Demikov was respected in his time and considered a pioneer of transplant surgery. His methods influenced surgeons around the world, including those who would later perform the first human heart transplants. The line between scientific genius and pure sadism has never been so blurred.
Project MKUltra, mass mind control. But if you think extreme experiments were limited to isolated individuals, prepare to discover one of the most extensive and sinister research programs ever conducted by a government. Project MKUltra was a CIA program that lasted from 1953 to 1973, and its goal was to develop methods of mind control and interrogation through drugs, psychological torture, and behavioral manipulation. What makes MKUltra particularly disturbing is its scale. More than 80 institutions were involved, including prestigious universities, hospitals, prisons, and psychiatric clinics. Thousands of Americans and Canadians were used as guinea pigs, many without their knowledge or consent. Patients in psychiatric hospitals, prisoners, soldiers, and even ordinary citizens became part of experiments that sought to completely break the human psyche. Dr. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Psychiatric Institute in Montreal conducted some of the program's most extreme experiments. He developed techniques he called deprogramming, processes that involve putting patients in drug-induced comas for weeks, subjecting them to intensive electroshock, and forcing them to listen to recorded messages repetitively for days on end. The goal was to literally erase a person's existing personality and rebuild it from scratch. Patients entered the hospital with minor problems like anxiety or mild depression, and left as human vegetables who couldn't remember their own names, recognize family members, or perform basic functions like using the bathroom. Cameron went so far as to test these techniques on his own sister-in-law, who sought treatment for postpartum depression and ended up completely losing her memory of her children and husband. She spent the rest of her life unable to remember who she was before the treatment.
The Stanford experiences creating psychological monsters. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted what would become one of the most controversial and ethically questionable psychological experiments in history, the Stanford Prison Experiment. What began as a study of human behavior quickly transformed into a terrifying demonstration of how normal people can become sadistic when placed in positions of power. Zimbardo divided university student volunteers into two groups, guards and prisoners. The experience was supposed to last for 2 weeks, but was interrupted after only 6 days because the guards began inflicting such severe psychological abuse on the prisoners that some participants had complete nervous breakdowns. The guards forced prisoners to do humiliating exercises, deprived them of food and sleep, made them clean toilets with their bare hands, and created increasingly creative and degrading punishments. Some prisoners developed acute traumatic stress symptoms that persisted for years after the experiment. But here's the most disturbing aspect. Zimbardo didn't just allow these abuses to happen, he encouraged them. As prison superintendent, he completely lost himself in his role and began to see the participants not as volunteer students, but as real prisoners who deserved punishment. The experiment was only stopped when Zimbardo's girlfriend, also a psychologist, visited the laboratory and was horrified by what she saw. Without her intervention, there is no doubt the experiment would have resulted in permanent psychological damage or even death.
The Holmesburg Human Laboratory. Between 1951 and 1974, Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia became the scene of some of the most extensive and ethically reprehensible medical experiments ever conducted on American soil. Dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman turned the prison into his personal laboratory, using prisoners as human guinea pigs for a variety of experiments that included testing chemicals, experimental drugs, and biological warfare agents. Kligman deliberately infected prisoners with skin diseases, burned their backs with chemicals, and tested the effects of dioxin, the same chemical agent used in Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. Prisoners were exposed to radiation doses, injected with experimental viruses, and subjected to unnecessary surgical procedures. The most shocking part is that many of these experiments had no legitimate medical purpose. Kligman was being paid by pharmaceutical companies and the government to test products and substances that were considered too dangerous to test on free volunteers. Prisoners received small amounts of money, sometimes just a few dollars, to submit to procedures that often resulted in permanent damage. One of the most famous prisoners was a man who had his back completely covered with test patches for more than 60 different substances simultaneously. His skin was permanently disfigured, covered with scars that looked like a macabre map of the experiments conducted on him. Kligman later admitted that he saw prisoners as acres of skin for his experiments, and that he rarely considered the ethical aspects of his research. He remained active in the medical community for decades, being respected as a pioneer of dermatology even after the exposure of his brutal methods. Conclusion and reflection. As we explore these dark chapters of scientific history, a disturbing question emerges. How many similar experiments are happening right now, masked by technical language and justified by scientific necessity? History teaches us that the line between legitimate scientific progress and institutionalized sadism is much thinner than we'd like to admit. These experiments weren't conducted by isolated lunatics in dark basements. They were performed by respected doctors at prestigious institutions, often with government funding. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The perpetrators of these horrors were ordinary people who made extraordinarily cruel decisions when placed in positions of scientific authority. The legacy of these experiments continues to haunt the scientific community today. They resulted in